Conmen, the most enigmatic of the criminal fraternity. These expert liars and consummate manipulators use their intoxicating charm to prey upon the most prized human trait, trust, in order to make money and ravage lives. Join us as we explore the lives and minds of some of the world's most notorious con men and women, exposing their shocking crimes, their twisted psychology, and how their cruel lies led to their eventual downfall. In this show, the man who swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, when he took to the stand as a forensic scientist.
Gene Morrison gave evidence in front of judges, juries, lawyers. No one had any idea that he was an utter con man.
The fake forensic expert worked for over 20 years on over 700 cases, all without a qualification to his name.
They were real cases in a real courtroom involving real people and their lives.
But no one could have predicted the dark and sickening world the con man was using his forensic persona to facilitate.
He went from fleecing innocent people out of their money to something much more sinister.
In 1997, Donald Pritchard launched his own audio forensic company. The business would analyze audio evidence for the police and private investigators, and the company's first commission came from a forensic investigator and private detective who ran the Criminal and Forensics Investigations Bureau.
Hi, is that Donald Pritchard?
He introduced himself as Dr. Gene Morrison from CIB Investigates, based in Manchester, and that he had a recording with a technical problem, and suggested that we might be the company to do this.
Oh, you have? Oh, brilliant, brilliant.
The doctor wanted Donald's expertise to analyze an audio tape recording. It didn't occur to Donald Pritchard that Gene Morrison wasn't who he said he was. He was simply over the moon to be gaining his first paid work in the forensic industry.
It was 10 hours work at £25 an hour, so the bill would be £250. Was that acceptable? And that was a yes. And in the fullness of time, we got a cheque for £250 that went into our company's bank accounts. The fact that he comes across as this genuine, sincere person automatically puts you at ease. And he obviously played on that.
Although Donald had landed his first job for his fledgling company, he could never have imagined that the man he was working for was not a doctor.
Gene Morrison, or Dr. Gene Morrison PhD, as he liked to be called, was a complete and utter con man who convinced everyone around him for more than 20 years that he was an expert in a whole string of forensic techniques and a private detective. The reality was he had no qualifications at all.
Donald never considered that the man he was working for was an utter charlatan. He also didn't know that Gene Morrison earned up to 10 times the amount he paid experts like him by passing their work off as his own.
What he would do in some of the cases would be to hire in a genuine expert, like for instance Donald Pritchard, pay him a nominal fee, then significantly inflate the bill and pass that on to the customer, thereby making a huge profit.
But completely unaware he was dealing with a con man and hungry to get his business off the ground, Donald Pritchard accepted a second and then third job. And with that third job came the opportunity to finally meet the mysterious Dr. Morrison.
And he asked for the material to be returned on a Sunday evening, as he needed it urgently for Monday for a court appearance. And I in fact drove up to Manchester to Sale with the processed material to give personally to Gene.
The venue for the meeting was a car park in Sale near Manchester.
Meeting in a car park at night, in the dark, handing over a package. It's almost like a scene from a film noir.
He had a lady passenger in the car with him, and he came across. I got ahead of my car. We shook hands. Not a lot was said, apart from thank you very much. I'll be in touch.
All right then.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Gene Morrison was clearly living out his CSI fantasies. He chose a location straight from a spy film under the cover of darkness. So clearly he was enjoying the dramatic elements of his role.
It was only after the third job had been delivered their business relationship with Gene Morrison began to falter.
Sadly, we didn't get paid for job number 3, and we waited for 12 months, 18 months, and took a decision collectively that we would write off that debt.
So one of the questions that you deal with conmen is, how come the mark never rats on it, never goes to the police? Why doesn't the mark ever sing? And the reason is because of what's technically known as the part of the con which is called the blow-off. And he either does it so the mark doesn't know he's been conned, or more often he relies on some aspects of just ordinary everyday psychology. Generally, marks, especially if it's a relatively modest sum of money they're talking about, is they will write it off to experience. Because they often don't see the bigger picture, the mark. You know, they're only just thinking about themselves. They've lost a little bit of money. They feel a bit rubbish, but on the whole, just write it off to experience. We're older and wiser, we move on. And they don't think about this guy going on to con other people. They don't think they might be part of a pattern, so they don't think about reporting it.
Donald Pritchard, like many of the people Gene Morrison duped, had no idea that the fake forensics pattern was actually taking their work and passing it off as his own. But making huge and dishonest profits wasn't illegal. However, what Gene Morrison did with that work was illegal. Gene Morrison astonishingly used the work he commissioned real scientists to do for him to work his way onto expert witness lists in courts across the land.
He's committing perjury, and not only that, a judge or a jury who believe him to be legitimate could pronounce somebody either guilty or not guilty based on his bogus testimony.
With his name on those expert witness lists, Dr. Gene Morrison had carte blanche to play fast and loose with the British justice system and make hundreds of thousands of pounds along the way.
We're talking about cases of rape, unexplained death, robbery, and he was treating all of this as though it was some sort of game of make-believe.
But this game of make-believe masked a dark and evil secret that no one could have imagined the con man was hiding.
I swear to tell the truth.
For over 20 years, Gene Morrison conned the British justice system into believing he was an expert witness.
Gene Morrison presented himself to the world as Dr. Gene Morrison, PhD, BSc. He told everyone that he had secured this degree at the Rocheville University in America. That doesn't exist as an institution. He actually bought a certificate on the web.
And Gene Morrison's background was far from the persona of a studious academic. He was born into a Jamaican family and moved to the UK when he was just 5 years old. He went to school in Manchester, but Gene Morrison did not distinguish himself academically and did not go on to higher education. However, legend has it that something happened to Morrison when he was a teenager that planted the seeds of his crime scene con.
The myth and rumour around this character is that he read a detective novel when he was about 19 years old and decided this is what he wanted to be, come what may.
This fascination with detective work ironically led Gene Morrison to deceive people. In 1977, without any qualifications whatsoever, and in his early 20s, he simply started working as a forensic investigator. Gene Morrison bought fake degrees and advertised his services in telephone directories and the Solicitor's Journal. The con man even set up his own business in Hyde, Manchester, to add to the illusion of his legitimacy.
The reception area was sleek and professional. It had a huge FBI-style sign with the company name on it, the Criminal and Forensic Investigation Bureau.
And also, his motto for business was so over the top, exposing unrighteousness for the sake of righteousness. Really, in context, that's incredibly ironic, but it also shows you just how over the top this person was and just how arrogant his fantasies were.
His business cards, the cards he handed out, even claimed that he was the 5th emergency service.
Gene Morrison was earning a living by dishonestly masquerading as a doctor in criminal psychology and falsely claiming he was an expert in forensic techniques such as blood and fingerprint analysis, polygraph testing, and facial mapping. With his props in place, Morrison could set to work, and the work he did for the private sector was unregulated. and so he wasn't technically breaking the law. But when defense solicitors began to call upon him for his services, never questioning his bogus qualifications, Morrison crossed the legal line, working on over 700 cases and taking to the stand as an expert witness.
Expert witnesses are called to give evidence during Crown Court trials. They help explain the technical and scientific issues and offer opinion about the scientific and technical evidence that's placed before the court.
He stood up under oath, claiming to be this forensic expert, and he gave so-called expert testimony on whatever subject he was asked to.
He's basically committing perjury. He's standing in a court and he's lying.
He testified in a series of cases across the United Kingdom.
An unexplained death, drug driving, rape, and his testimony was worthless, useless.
Having built a reputation in forensic analysis, in 1997, the con man was approached to be an expert witness in an armed robbery case.
He was asked to analyse CCTV footage that police believe linked a defendant to an armed robbery. What in actual fact he did was simply pass the work on.
At the time, one of the specialists Morrison was conning was audio analyst Donald Pritchard. Donald believed he was doing legitimate work for the con man, so when Morrison approached him with the video footage, Donald was as helpful as possible.
I didn't have video expertise. I believed I was doing the right thing. I was being honest with Gene, saying, look, there's an aspect of this I can't deal with, but I have a friend over in Leicester who perhaps can help you. Walter was into video production and see what he could do. And Walter was the same as I was, would accept Gene on face value because you expected everybody to be straight, genuine with you. But unfortunately, conmen obviously take that as a weakness.
And Gene Morrison would also ensure that the expert's good nature resulted in him making a healthy profit.
What the retired filmmaker didn't know was that although Gene had actually knocked him down from £200 to £50, he was actually charging the defence solicitors £2,800.
The filmmaker had unwittingly completed the analysis for a con man, masquerading as a doctor in criminal psychology. No one knows if Morrison's initial motivation was purely financial, but it's clear his actions weren't solely to con cash.
Gene Morrison is making a very good living from this, from essentially doing very little, because all he has to do is pass the work on to other people and then sit back and take the credit. But there's got to be something else going on here. When he's giving evidence in court, he's very important, he's special, he's vital. And I think that he must have got a thrill from the respect that he got, because why else would he take such a risk to tamper with the law so flagrantly in the heart of the justice system?
Between 2002 and 2005 alone, Gene Morrison made at least £250,000 in taxpayers' money as an expert witness. With his expert victims, like Donald Pritchard, the con man was paid at least double what he offered them for their services, and Gene Morrison's con ran for an astounding 26 years. The money he made was mind-boggling. But Morrison's con was not just about money. The CSI super sleuth preyed upon the most vulnerable people in order to live out his twisted forensic fantasy.
One of the most upsetting cases involved a family who had lost their son in mysterious circumstances. The man concerned was 29 years of age and was found dead in his bedroom at home. An unexplained death. It was a tragedy for the family.
The tragedy occurred in 2003, and although the coroner had reported an open verdict, it seemed, at the time, to the devastated parents that possibly their son's job could have played a part in his tragic death.
He worked as a quality controller at a chemical factory, and so the big question for his family was whether the chemicals and toxins that he worked with on a daily basis had contributed to his death.
And the family decided to look for someone who could help get to the bottom of what had caused their son's untimely death. And they came across Gene Morrison in the telephone book.
The family gave him a call and initially were very impressed, especially when he rattled off a list of qualifications including an MSc, a BSc, a PhD.
Believing that Gene Morrison was a respectable professional in their local community and more than qualified, the grieving parents hired him to explore the circumstances of their young son's death.
The grieving family could only afford to get together £600 to pay up front. Jean Morrison was more than willing to accept the money.
With £600 in his pocket, Dr. Jean Morrison, PhD, began his investigation. But the conman's techniques were less than orthodox.
With hindsight, it's quite plain to see that Jean's techniques were strange, to say the least. How he began his investigation was to ring around the deceased man's friends. With the women, the conversations took place at night and were quite flirtatious. With the male friends, he would invite them to his office, then simply leave them waiting and not speak to them at all. At the time, the family wondered whether this might be perhaps some kind of strategy, an investigative technique.
Because people believe that he's a qualified forensic scientist and investigator, they're prepared to dismiss actions that normally we would think are quite inappropriate. We think, well, this is a qualified person, their methods are strange, but who am I? I'm just a layperson. I'm not able to question their methods.
Although he was eccentric, the family were led to believe that Dr. Jean Morrison was running a legitimate operation.
On one occasion, he pointed out a rather impressive glass-fronted building, claiming that this was where his labs were. In actual fact, this was the local breast screening clinic.
Although the labs were fake, real tests were being done. But in his typical style, Jean Morrison was subcontracting the work to genuine experts.
He took away the young man's laptop and his clothes. His clothes were sent to a genuine toxicologist for analysis, and he asked a genuine and qualified computer expert to go through the laptop to see if there were any clues as to what may have happened in the run-up to his death.
After months of waiting, the mysterious Jean Morrison finally presented the grieving family with a document they believed would contain the answers they so desperately needed.
He presented the family with a report that was over 70 pages long. 69 pages of that was made up of technical information that was provided by the toxicologist. It would have made no sense whatsoever to a layman. A further 2 or 3 pages of the report consisted of a very vague description of the circumstances surrounding the young man's death. It didn't draw any useful conclusions at all.
After months of hoping and waiting, the young man's mother and father still had no idea how their son had tragically died.
The family were hoping to find some sort of peace of mind, get the answers that they needed in order to move forward with their life. And what Jean Morrison did was to promise them something that actually he wasn't qualified to do, because he isn't a forensic investigator, he's a con man. But then he gives them false hope, dashes that hope, and then stumps them with a bill for £14,000. So really, he's a swine.
The family clearly was so dissatisfied with the work that Jean Morrison did, or claimed to have done, that they refused to pay him.
But the family's refusal to pay the heartless conman and fake forensic was not the end of the affair. Unbelievably, the shyster decided to take the family to court and sue them for £14,000 in November 2004.
He was adamant that he was owed the money, that he had done the work. He was equally adamant about his bogus qualifications.
Taking this family to court, apart from the fact that actually he was contributing to the stress and the trauma that they'd already experienced, is really quite breathtaking. In the arrogance of it, the fact that he's willing to be more exposed and risk his whole con unravelling is mystifying.
However, the court case did not go the way he had planned.
At the end of the case, the judge said that Jean was entitled to charge the family, but at a vastly reduced rate, not the £14,000 he had demanded at the beginning.
Morrison may not have succeeded in getting the money he wanted, but he left the court unchecked. And in the same year, 2004, the fake forensic was once again hired by a solicitor as an expert witness. This time, his expertise was requested in a rape case.
A condom wrapper was found at the scene of a rape. Jean Morrison was brought in by a defence lawyer to analyse the wrapper for fingerprints.
Gene Morrison subcontracted the fingerprint analysis and paid the genuine experts £252. But Morrison repackaged the report and billed the law firm almost £2,000. But that wasn't all he did.
But what was different was that on this case, he decided to do some detective work of his own.
He's not been hired to do this, he's been hired to offer his expert opinion on a fingerprint on a condom wrapper, but he takes it upon himself to act as some kind of super sleuth. He seems to think of himself as some modern day Sherlock Holmes and goes about it in the most inappropriate fashion.
Gene Morrison should have left that detective work to the professionals.
Unbelievably, in this case, Gene telephoned Strangeways Prison, asked to speak to the defendant. While he was on the telephone, proceeded to make a list of demands of other items of information that he required in relation to the case. One of the pieces of information that he asked for was the name and address of the rape victim.
And the prison officer who took the call was stunned by the fake forensic investigator's request.
Obviously, the prison service were not going to hand over that confidential information that Gene Morrison had asked for, but they realised something was wrong and they acted.
Gene Morrison's attempt to con Strangeways Prison would finally be his undoing.
So after 20 years of being taken at face value, staff at Strangeways did what everyone else had failed to do. They contacted the police to say something was seriously amiss with this guy.
But even staff at Strangeways could not have predicted the dark and evil twist that was to come. For over 20 years, Gene Morrison masqueraded as a forensic investigator and private detective, a position that bogusly earned him the trust and respect of his local community, a trust he would later abuse horribly. He claimed to have a degree, a master's and a doctorate, and made over £250,000 in taxpayers' money when he took to the stand and perjured himself under the guise of being an expert witness.
We can see that he's really starting to believe his own persona that he's constructed, and he's starting to believe his own lies, and he's really bought into this whole CSI myth.
However, in 2004, the cracks were beginning to show in his conman deception after he pushed his luck too far and attempted to obtain confidential information from Strangeways Prison in Manchester.
So after receiving a very strange phone call from a man who wanted to know the name and address of a rape victim, Strangeways staff decided they needed to call the police. The police immediately launched an investigation.
After 20 years of faking it as a forensic investigator and respected member of his local community, the police were scrutinising the conman's career for the first time. In January 2005, they obtained a warrant to search his home and office.
The police found piles of videos of the American TV series CSI, so it's very worrying to think that actually this was his source of research and information. But also you have to wonder whether he watched these programmes as a way of living out his CSI fantasies with him as the hero.
And the office was an Aladdin's cave for Morrison's forensic fantasy.
When the police went into the office, they were met again with mounds of paperwork, literally everywhere. There were a couple of items that did stick out as a little bizarre though. Amongst them was a white lab coat, some test tubes and a huge magnifying glass.
These props are rather telling and also really quite cartoon-like. He's chosen 3 things which embody I am a forensic investigator, the white coat and the test tubes, but also a giant magnifying glass. What is that all about? You know, that really is saying I am a cartoon super sleuth.
The props the police had uncovered were not going to convince them that Gene Morrison was legitimate. It looked like the conman's forensic scam was over.
The police immediately shut down the operation. They took down the website and began the arduous task of going through the paperwork to see if his interfering with the justice system over all those years had resulted in a miscarriage of justice along the way.
But there was a problem with the case. It appeared that Gene Morrison could get away with his crimes because of a legal loophole.
Gene Morrison was selling himself as a private investigator and forensic scientist, and conveniently for him, these areas were at that time totally unregulated within the United Kingdom, so there was no one to watch over anyone who decided to set themselves up in this way.
If the police were going to successfully bring the fake forensic to justice, they must expose the secret he kept from all his clients.
The police began to look at his actual qualifications, the fact that he claimed he had a PhD and a doctorate and this and that. If they could disprove those qualifications, that would be the key to actually being able to bring him before a court and convict him.
If the police could prove that the degrees were not legitimate, then it was obvious that Gene Morrison had fraudulently misrepresented himself. If they could also prove that he'd done that in court, then there'd be another charge to his name: perjury.
Once the police began to investigate the fake forensic, they were astounded at the disturbing scale of Morrison's con. Gene Morrison had offered his expert opinion on 700 working cases. That was potentially 700 miscarriages of justice that the con man had caused. Not only that, but between 2002 and 2005, the courts had paid the con man over £250,000 in taxpayers' money for his bogus work. The scale of the con was monumental and was simply a sample of a 26-year-long bogus career. It was vital the police could prove that Morrison had invented his impressive qualifications, and so he was brought in for questioning to discuss his education, or lack of it.
So what is the qualification that you have? I have a PhD, but it's not recognised here.
I have listened to the police interviews with Gene Morrison. The man cannot and does not answer a straight question.
Even the simplest line of questioning failed to lead to simple, factual answers.
The police interviewer tries to verbally wrestle Gene Morrison into giving a straight answer. It doesn't work. It takes 4 questions alone to try and get to grips with what his qualifications actually are. Initially, he says he got the qualification in America, then he says it's not recognised over here, then it's not a degree, it's a PhD. The answers change moment by moment.
I have a PhD, but it's not recognised here.
In what?
Criminal psychology.
Obtained where?
In the States.
At times, his efforts to try and confuse the police look more like he's confused himself.
I know it sounds silly, but something like Sherlock Holmes, who was just a detective, and then using some skills, etc., he started to apply knowledge of science.
He was equally as evasive when police asked him about his claims that he'd studied in Germany and the Czech Republic. He was unable to tell them where in Germany he'd studied, who had taught him while he was over there, where the university was.
You've gone and studied something in Germany, you've gone and studied something in the Czech Republic. Yeah. Have you received any recognisable qualifications?
I don't know if it's recognised here, but I have received a certificate from them. It's just for me, you know, making my head bigger. Because I like studying, I like to do things.
What did you receive in Germany then? And who did you study with in Germany?
I don't know the names. They were friends of those in the Czech Republic.
Where was it in Germany?
I don't know the place.
He's clearly floundering at this stage, and at one point he exclaims, "Crikey, I can't remember where I got my degree."
At which university?
Crikey, I can't remember it. It's associated with the International Federation for work which I'd already done here and abroad.
Is this in California?
Well, that's the head place in California.
Is that where you studied?
Yeah.
You studied in California?
Well, no, I didn't study in California. Glendale, California is where the head office would have been. I studied in Massachusetts.
He then diverts again, saying it was life experience, it wasn't a degree. Then later changes his mind again and says he's got more than one degree.
Which one?
How many have you got?
No, you said your degree, you're single. That's what I'm asking, which one are you talking about?
Well, you just told me you've got one degree. Have you got more than one degree?
I don't have a recognisable degree.
At one point, the police asked whether he could produce or even just get a copy of his degrees to show that he had actually studied at these rather vague institutions.
How would I trace that degree that you hold in America?
I don't know how you would go about doing that.
I take it you wouldn't be able to get a copy of anything to evidence that degree?
I wouldn't be able to get it for yourself now.
A private investigator who doesn't know how to copy his own degree certificate? That seems preposterous, doesn't it?
The reality regarding Gene Morrison's academic career was that he had simply purchased degrees online. It looked likely the police would charge Gene Morrison, but the fact the police had launched a full investigation into him and his fake forensic business was not enough to stop his lies and deception.
Even with the police raiding his home, his business shut down and under investigation, Gene cannot resist the opportunity to continue the con. The police have said to him, "Come on now, Gene, the game is up, you need to stop." But he's so determined and so deluded that he can't actually put down his giant spyglass, so to speak, and stop it.
Gene Morrison was in serious trouble with the police in Manchester, but 60 miles away in Nottingham, the fake forensic was still on the expert witness list, and a Nottingham-based solicitor called him for his so-called expertise on a Crown Court case.
Dr. Gene Morrison?
So when Gene Morrison took that last job in Nottingham, after he'd already been held up by the police, I think it's an interesting example, a really telling example of the almost compulsive nature of his scamming. He almost can't help himself. There's something almost involuntary about it.
Yeah, let me just take your details.
The case Gene Morrison was being paid to analyse and offer his expert opinion on was for the legal team defending a client who was being accused of drug dealing.
The solicitor in Nottingham asked him to examine a set of scales that the police expert had said contained fingerprints and traces of cocaine. It was his job to see whether that assessment by the police was correct.
The aim presumably was for Gene Morrison, an expert as far as they were concerned, was to call into question whether or not those fingerprints were of the accused.
Despite the Manchester police closing in and building a case to formally charge Gene Morrison, the fake forensic simply continued business as usual.
True to form, as he had done on previous cases, Gene Morrison decided to bring in a real expert to look at the fingerprints. However, when it came to the drugs residue, he decided to write that report himself. The report contained some very glaring errors, not least numerous spelling mistakes. He'd even missed the E off the end of cocaine.
While in Nottingham, Morrison arranged to meet with Adam Booker, the forensic chemist who had written the report for the police regarding the scales under scrutiny.
When I first saw Gene Morrison in the reception of the building I work in, he was wearing a high visibility yellow jacket, and across the back it said forensic investigator, which I thought was bizarre and very odd, but it could just be that he was quite eccentric. That was my first thought.
And Dr. Morrison was not alone when he came to the lab.
We had quite a young, probably late teenage girl with him accompanying him to the visit, which is, again, just very, very odd. Normally these people will work alone and certainly not bring along a girlfriend. And for the entire time that he was there, she was texting on a mobile phone and constantly asking him when they were going to leave, complaining about how long they'd been there, and he was quite dismissive of her, telling him to be quiet and sort of wait for him to finish working.
How much longer?
Not much longer, all right? Not much longer.
And the doctor's behaviour in the lab was utterly bizarre.
Although he talked about his qualifications and experience as a chemist, at one point I looked over and he'd taken one of the results out of the file, which was one of the analytical results, the chromatograms, and he was looking at it upside down. So he was holding the piece of paper upside down and sort of nodding at it, looking like he was reading it when he clearly didn't know what it was.
The fact that Adam Booker knew that Dr. Gene Morrison was an expert witness hired by the defence team lessened his suspicions.
I was not thinking that he was some sort of fraudster or con man, because it's not something that you expect in everyday life. You expect that maybe he's stepping outside of his main area of expertise and trying to get work in areas that he doesn't really know too much about. But at the time it wasn't something that crossed my mind that he was a complete fraud.
However, Adam Booker soon learned the truth that Dr. Morrison was in fact a complete fraud.
Right, when did this happen?
It was only a few days after Gene Morrison's visit to the lab that I got a phone call at work from a police officer who's investigating Gene Morrison for being a fraudster. It then sort of clicked into place that he was looking at the instrumental readout upside down. He was asking naive questions, the way that he was dressed, the fact that he brought his young girlfriend with him. They were all things that were odd, and this sort of confirmed there were unusual things, but I was still quite surprised that he was being investigated for being a complete fraud. I don't ever expect somebody to be a complete con.
The Manchester police had exposed that Gene Morrison was a liar, and he was dropped from the case. After 26 years, the game was up for the fake forensic.
He was charged and a court date was set, but with the wealth of evidence that the police had gathered, it seemed like the trial would be just a formality.
The law had finally caught up with the conman, and in September 2006, Gene Morrison once again found himself taking the stand in court. Only this time, he was the accused.
I've been a journalist now for more than 10 years, and a big proportion of my career to date was spent as a crime reporter. So I've attended quite a few court cases. This one at Manchester Crown Court tops the lot. It was the most bizarre court case I've ever attended.
Gene Morrison did not wear his luminous forensic investigator jacket, but he did make quite an impression.
At the trial, when he was called to give evidence, it seemed that he quite enjoyed the experience. He wore half-moon glasses and took his time poring over the documents. He seemed to really enjoy the attention.
My main memory of being there was there was quite an odd atmosphere. There was an awful lot of talking and laughing going on in the courtroom, and Gene Morrison himself was sat off at the back in the dock. He was very smartly dressed in a three-piece suit. He had a little pair of half-moon glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was surrounded by box files, and all the way through my evidence, I'm sure he was all the way through the trial, he had a file open in front of him. He was making a lot of notes and talking to himself and others around him over the course of the trial. It was a very unusual experience.
It's almost like he's played the part as the CSI super sleuth, and now he's this legal eagle.
He even went to the extent of trying to insist that people address him in court as Dr. Morrison, even though it was blatantly a fiction. He's as much a doctor as I am.
And the strangeness continued when Gene Morrison took to the stand.
At times, the jury were just in hysterics. It was farcical. At one stage, he adopted an American accent. It just emerged out of nowhere. It was very, very strange. And when he was asked why this change of accent all the time, he said it was something that he did.
This man had been living in Manchester for over 40 years. He'd never visited the USA, let alone studied there. So it's really quite farcical, isn't it? The courtroom must have wondered what on earth was wrong with this man. I think that he is the ultimate fantasist.
And the trial became stranger when Morrison was cross-examined about his qualifications.
As he claimed to be a forensic expert, he was questioned about what this entailed on the stand. Whilst he was being quizzed about the blood testing, the judge actually stopped him and said,
I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but you're confusing me.
To be honest, Your Honour, I'm kind of confusing myself.
When he said that, the jury were just in hysterics.
And the trial descended into further chaos.
Another occasion when Morrison ended up tying himself in knots was when he tried to suggest that he had been trained in some of his forensic expertise by an expert from the Czech Republic. He created a real fantastical tale about a Mr. X who he said had taught him his forensic techniques. When pressed on this, he said he couldn't possibly reveal the name in open court. However, he did offer the judge the chance to hear the name in a whispered conversation in private in the corridor. The judge said that that wasn't really how we do things in court here.
Despite the laughter, the jury retired to deliberate their verdict. And while the court waited, Gene Morrison approached Nicola Dowling.
I asked him whether he had prepared himself for the fact that he might be going to prison. Had he said goodbye to his family? Had he packed a bag? He was completely shocked at the question and said that it hadn't crossed his mind that he would be going to prison because God was on his side.
And the fake forensic was confident that he would walk away from court.
He asked me if I had noticed that there had been a number of signs along the way as the trial had progressed that indicated that things were going to go his way. Signs from God, if you like. The kind of things that he was talking about was a juror was ill, so couldn't come one day. One of the lawyers was late because the train was delayed. All of that was interpreted by him as a sign from God that he didn't need to worry because the result was going to go his way.
But Gene Morrison could not have been more wrong. It seemed he had misread the signs.
The charges included perjury and perverting the course of justice. The entire court was left in no doubt that he was guilty.
Gene Morrison had actually pleaded guilty to just 2 charges, but the jury, despite laughing through an awful lot of the trial, actually convicted him of 20 other offences.
All that was left was for the judge to pass sentence in March 2007.
Despite the slightly strange atmosphere in court, the judge actually sentenced Morrison